Chapter 30. 217 Revisited. He took the elevator up, and it was strange, because none of them had used the elevator since they moved in. He threw the brass handle over, and it wheezed vibratoriously up the shaft. The brass gate rattling madly. Wendy had a true claustrophobe's horror of the elevator, he knew. She envisioned the three of them trapped in it between floors while the winter storms raged outside. She could see them growing thinner and weaker, starving to death. Or perhaps dining on each other the way those rugby players had. He remembered a bumper sticker he had seen in Boulder. Rugby players eat their own dead. He could think of others. You are what you eat. Or menu items. Welcome to the overlooked dining room, pride of the Rockies. Eat in the splendor at the roof of the world. Human haunch broiled over matches, la spécialité de la maison. A contemptuous smile flicked over his features again as the number 2 rose on the shaft wall. He threw the brass handle back to the home position, and the elevator car creaked to a stop. He took his Excedrin from his pocket, shook 3 of them into his hand, and opened the elevator door. Nothing in the overlook frightened him. He felt that he and it were simpatico. He walked up the hall, flipping his Excedrin into his mouth and chewing them one by one. He rounded the corner into the short corridor off the main hall. The door to room 217 was ajar, and the passkey hung from the lock on its white paddle. He frowned, feeling a wave of irritation and even real anger. Whatever had come of it, the boy had been trespassing. He had been told, and told bluntly, certain areas of the hotel were off limits. The equipment shed, the basement, and all the guest rooms. He would talk to Danny about that just as soon as the boy was over his fright. He would talk to him reasonably but sternly. There were plenty of fathers who would have done more than just talk. They would have administered a good shaking, and perhaps that was what Danny needed. If the boy had gotten a scare, wasn't that at least his just desserts? He walked down to the door, removed the passkey, dropped it into his pocket, and stepped inside. The overhead light was on. He glanced at the bed, saw it was not rumpled, and then walked directly across to the bathroom door. A curious certainty had grown on him. Although Watson had mentioned no names or room numbers, Jack felt sure that this was the room the lawyer's wife and her stud had shared. That this was the bathroom where she had been found dead, full of barbiturates and Colorado lounge booze. He pushed the mirror-backed bathroom door open and stepped through. The light in there was off. He turned it on and observed the long Pullman car room, furnished in the distinctive early 1900s, remodeled in the 20th style that seemed common to all overlooked bathrooms, except for the ones on the 3rd floor. Those were properly Byzantine, as befitted the royalty, politicians, movie stars, and capos that had stayed there over the years. The shower curtain, a pallid pastel pink, was drawn protectively around the long claw-footed tub. Nevertheless, they did move. and for the first time he felt his new sense of sureness, almost cockiness, that had come over him when Danny ran to him shouting, "It was her! It was her!" deserting him. A chilled finger pressed gently against the base of his spine, cooling him off 10 degrees. It was joined by others, and they suddenly rippled all the way up his back to his medulla oblongata, playing his spine like a jungle instrument. His anger at Danny evaporated, and as he stepped forward and pushed the shower curtain back, his mouth was dry, and he felt only sympathy for his son and terror for himself. The tub was dry and empty. Relief and irritation vented in a sudden "pah" sound that escaped his compressed lips like a very small explosive. The tub had been scrubbed clean at the end of the season. Except for the rust stain under the twin faucets, it sparkled. There was a faint but definable smell of cleanser, the kind that can irritate your nose with the smell of its own righteousness for weeks, even months after it had been used. He bent down and ran his fingertips along the bottom of the tub. Dry as a bone. Not even a hint of moisture. The boy had been either hallucinating or outright lying. He felt angry again. That was when the bath mat on the floor caught his attention. He frowned down at it. What was a bath mat doing in here? It should be down in the linen cupboard at the end of the wing with the rest of the sheets and towels and pillow slips. All the linen was supposed to be there. Not even the beds were really made up in these guest rooms. The mattresses had been zipped into clear plastic and then covered with bedspreads. He supposed Danny might have gone down and gotten it. The pass key would open the linen cupboard, but why? He brushed the tips of his fingers back and forth across it. The bath mat was bone dry. He went back to the bathroom doorway and stood in it. Everything was all right. The boy had been dreaming. There was not a thing out of place. It was a little puzzling about the bath mat, granted, but the logical explanation was that some chambermaid hurrying like mad on the last day of the season had just forgotten to pick it up. Other than that, everything was... His nostrils flared a little. Disinfectant. That self-righteous smell. Cleaner than thou. And... soap? Surely not. But once the smell had been identified, it was too clear to dismiss. Soap. And not one of those postcard-sized bars of ivory they provide you with in hotels and motels either. This scent was light and perfumed, a lady's soap. It had a pink sort of smell. Camay or Lowilla, the brand that Wendy had always used to get in Stovington. It's nothing, it's your imagination. Yes, like the hedges, nevertheless, they did move. They did not move. He crossed jerkily to the door, which gave on the hall, feeling the irregular thump of a headache beginning at his temples. Too much had happened today, too much by far. He wouldn't spank the boy, or shake him, just talk to him. But by God, he wasn't going to add room 217 to his problems. Not on the basis of a dry bath mat and the faint smell of Lowilla soap. There was a sudden rattling metallic sound behind him. It came just as his hand closed around the doorknob, and an observer might have thought the brushed steel of the knob carried an electric charge. He jerked convulsively, eyes widening, other facial features drawing in, grimacing. Then he had control of himself, a little anyway, and he let go of the doorknob and turned carefully around. His joints creaked. He began to walk back to the bathroom door, step by leaden step. The shower curtain, which he had pushed back to look into the tub, was now drawn. The metallic rattle, which had sounded to him like a stir of bones in a crypt, had been the curtain rings on the overhead bar. Jack stared at the curtain. His face felt as if it had been heavily waxed, all dead skin on the outside, live, hot rivulets of fear on the inside. The way he had felt on the playground. There was something behind the pink plastic shower curtain. There was something in the tub. He could see it, ill-defined and obscure through the plastic, a nearly amorphous shape. Could have been anything. A trick of the light, a shadow of the shower attachment, a woman long dead and reclining in her bath, a bar of Lowilla in one stiffening hand as she waited patiently for whatever lover might come. Jack told himself to step forward boldly and rake the shower curtain back, to expose whatever might be there. Instead, he turned with jerky marionette strides, his heart whamming frightfully in his chest, and went back into the bed sitting room. The door to the hall was shut. He stared at it for a long, immobile second. He could taste his terror now. It was in the back of his throat like a taste of gone-over cherries. He walked to the door with that same jerky stride and forced his fingers to curl around the knob. It won't open. But it did. He turned off the light with a fumbling gesture, stepped out into the hall, and pulled the door shut without looking back. From inside, he seemed to hear an odd, wet thumping sound, far off, dim, as if someone had just scrambled belatedly out of the tub, as if to greet a caller, as if it had recognized the caller was leaving before the social amenities had been completed, and so it was now rushing to the door, all purple and grinning, to invite the caller back inside, perhaps forever. Footsteps approaching the door, or only the heartbeat in his ears. He fumbled at the passkey. It seemed sludgy, unwilling to turn in the lock. He attacked the passkey. The tumblers suddenly fell, and he stepped back against the corridor's far wall, a little groan of relief escaping him. He closed his eyes, and all the old phrases began to parade through his mind. It seemed there must be hundreds of them. Cracking up, not playing with the full deck. Lost your marbles, guy. Just went Looney Tunes. He went up and over the high side, went bananas. Lost his football crackers, nuts, half a sea bag. All meaning the same thing, losing your mind. No, he whispered, hardly aware that he had been reduced to this, whimpering with his eyes shut like a child. Oh no, God, please, God, no. But below the tumble of his chaotic thoughts, below the trip-hammer beat of his heart, he could hear the soft and futile sound of the doorknob being turned to and fro as something locked and tried helplessly to get out. Something that wanted to meet him. Something that would like to be introduced to his family as the storm shrieked around them and white daylight became black night. If he opened his eyes and saw that doorknob moving, he would go mad. So he kept them shut. And after an unnotable time, there was stillness. Jack forced himself to open his eyes, half convinced that when he did, she would be standing before him. But the hall was empty. He felt watched just the same. He looked at the peephole in the center of the door and wondered what would happen if he approached it, stared into it. What would he be eyeball to eyeball with? His feet were moving. Feet don't fail me now. Before he realized it, he turned them away from the door and walked down to the main hall, his feet whispering on the blue-black jungle carpet. He stopped halfway to the stairs and looked at the fire extinguisher. He thought that the folds of canvas were arranged in a slightly different manner, and he was quite sure that the brass nozzle had been pointing toward the elevator when he came to the hall. Now it was pointing the other way. I didn't see that at all, Jack Torrance said quite clearly. His face was white and haggard, and his mouth kept trying to grin. But he didn't take the elevator back down. It was too much like an open mouth. Too much by half. He took the stairs. Chapter 31. The Verdict. He stepped into the kitchen and looked at them, bouncing the passkey a few inches up off his left hand, making the chain on the white metal tongue jingle, then catching it again. Danny was pallid and worn out. Wendy had been crying, he saw. Her eyes were red and darkly circled. He felt a sudden burst of gladness at this. He wasn't suffering alone, that was sure. They looked at him without speaking. "Nothing there," he said, astounded by the heartiness of his voice. "Not a thing." He bounced the passkey up and down, smiling reassuringly at them, watching the relief spread over their faces, and thought he had never in his life wanted a drink so badly as he did right now. Chapter 32. The Bedroom. Late that afternoon, Jack got a cot from the first floor storage room, put it in the corner of their bedroom. Wendy had expected that the boy would be half the night at getting to sleep, but Danny was nodding before the Waltons were half over. And 15 minutes after they had tucked him in, he was far down in sleep, moveless, one hand tucked under his cheek. Wendy sat watching him, holding her place in a fat paperback copy of Cashel Mara with one finger. Jack sat at his desk, looking at his play. "Oh, shit," Jack said. Wendy looked up from her contemplation of Danny. "What?" Nothing." He looked down at the play with smoldering ill temper. How could he have thought it was good? It was puerile. It had been done 1,000 times. Worse, he had no idea how to finish it. Once it had seemed simple enough. Dinker, in a fit of rage, seizes the poker from beside the fireplace and beats saintly Gary to death. Then, standing spread-legged over the body, the bloody poker in one hand, he screams at the audience, "It's here somewhere, and I will find it!" Then, as the lights dim and the curtain is slowly drawn, the audience sees Gary's body face down on the forestage as Dinker strides to the upstage bookcase and feverishly begins pulling books from the shelves, looking at them, throwing them aside. He had thought it was something old enough to be new, a play whose novelty alone might be enough to see it through a successful Broadway run, a tragedy in 5 acts. But in addition to his sudden diversion of interest to the overlooked history, something else had happened. He had developed opposing feelings about his characters. This was something quite new. Ordinarily, he liked all of his characters, the good and the bad. He was glad he did. It allowed him to try to see all of their sides and understand their motivations more clearly. His favorite story sold to a small southern Maine magazine called Contraband for Copies. It was called Contraband. he did it for copies, had been a piece called The Monkey Is Here. Paul DeLong. It was called The Monkey Is Here, Paul DeLong. Oh boy. It had been about a child molester about to commit suicide in his furnished room. The child molester's name had been Paul DeLong, Monkey to his friends. Jack had liked Monkey very much. He sympathized with Monkey's bizarre needs, knowing that Monkey was not the only one to blame for the 3 rape murders in his past. There had been bad parents. The father a beater, as his own father had been. The mother a limp and silent dish rag, as his mother had been. A homosexual experience in grammar school, public humiliation. Worse experiences in high school and college. He had been arrested and sent to an institution after exposing himself to a pair of little girls getting off a school bus. Worst of all, he had been dismissed from the institution, let back out onto the streets, because the man in charge had decided he was all right. This man's name had been Grimmer. Grimmer had known that Monkey DeLong was exhibiting deviant symptoms, but he had written the good, hopeful report and had let him go anyway. Jack liked and sympathized with Grimmer, too. Grimmer had to run an understaffed and underfunded institution and try to keep the whole thing together with spit, baling wire, and nickel and dime appropriations from a state legislature who had to go back and face the voters. Grimmer knew that Monkey could interact with other people, that he did not soil his pants or try to stab his fellow inmates with the scissors. He did not think he was Napoleon. The staff psychiatrist in charge of Monkey's case thought there was a better than even chance that Monkey could make it on the street. And they both knew that the longer a man is in an institution, the more he comes to need that closed environment, like a junkie with his smack. And meanwhile, people were knocking down the doors. Paranoids, schizoids, cycloids, semi-catatonics. Men who claimed to have gone to heaven in flying saucers. Women who burned their children's sex organs off with Bic lighters. Alcoholics, pyromaniacs, kleptomaniacs, manic depressives, suicidals. Tough old world, baby. If you're not bolted together tightly, you're gonna shake, rattle, and roll before you turn 30. Jack could sympathize with Grimmer's problem. He could sympathize with the parents of the murder victims, with the murdered children themselves, of course, and with Monkey DeLong. Let the reader lay blame. In those days, he hadn't wanted to judge. The cloak of the moralist sat badly on his shoulders. He had started the little school in the same optimistic vein, but lately he had begun to choose up sides, and worse still, he had come to loathe his hero, Gary Benson. Originally conceived as a bright boy more cursed with money than blessed with it, a boy who wanted more than anything to compile a good record so he could go to a good university because he had earned admission, and not because his father had pulled strings. He had become to Jack a kind of simpering goody-two-shoes, a postulant before the altar of knowledge rather than a sincere acolyte, an outward paragon of Boy Scout virtues, inwardly cynical, filled not with real brilliance, as he had first been conceived, but only with sly animal cunning. All through the play, he unfailingly addressed Dinker as Sir, just as Jack had taught his own son to address those older and those in authority as Sir. He thought that Danny used the word quite sincerely, and Gary Benson, as originally conceived, had too. But as he had begun Act 5, it had become more and more strongly to him that Gary was using the word satirically, outwardly straight-faced, while the Gary Benson inside was mugging and leering at Dinker. Dinker, who had never had any of the things Gary had. Dinker, who had had to work all his life just to become head of a single little school, who was now faced with ruin over his handsome, innocent-seeming rich boy, who had cheated on his final composition and had then cunningly covered his tracks. Jack had seen Dinker the teacher as not much different from the strutting South American Little Caesars in their banana kingdoms, standing dissidents up against the wall of the handiest squash or handball court, a super zealot in a comparatively small puddle, a man whose every whim becomes a crusade. In the beginning, he had wanted to use his play as a microcosm to say something about the abuse of power. Now he tended more and more to see Dinker as a Mr. Chips figure. And the tragedy was not the intellectual racking of Gary Benson, but rather the destruction of a kindly old teacher and headmaster unable to see through the cynical wiles of this monster masquerading as a boy. He hadn't been able to finish the play. Now he sat looking down at it, scowling, wondering if there was any way he could salvage the situation. He didn't really think there was. He'd begun with one play, it had somehow turned into another. Presto changeo. But what the hell? Either way, it had been done before. Either way, it was a load of shit. And why was he driving himself crazy about it tonight anyway? After the day just gone by, it was no wonder he couldn't think straight. Get him down. He looked up, trying to blink the cobwebs away. Huh?
I said, how are we going to get him down? We've got to get him out of here, Jack.
For a moment, his wits were so scattered, he wasn't even sure what she was talking about. Then he realized and uttered a short, barking laugh. You say that as if it were so easy.
I didn't mean...
No problem, Wendy. I'll just change clothes in that telephone booth down in the lobby, fly him down to Denver on my back. Superman Jack Torrance. They called me in my salad days. Her face registered slow hurt.
I understand the problem, Jack. The radio is broken. The snow. But you have to understand Danny's problem. My God, don't you? He was nearly catatonic, Jack. What if he hadn't come out of that?
But he did, Jack said, a trifle shortly. He had been frightened at Danny's blank-eyed slack face too, of course. Of course he had. At first. But the more he thought about it, the more he wondered if it hadn't been a piece of play acting put on to escape his punishment. He had, after all, been trespassing.
All the same, she said.
She came to him and sat on the end of the bed by his desk. Her face was both surprised and worried.
Jack, the bruises on his neck. Something got at him, and I want him away from it.
Don't shout, he said. My head aches, Wendy. I'm as worried about this as you are, so please don't shout.
All right, she said, lowering her voice. I won't shout, but I don't understand you, Jack. Someone is in here with us, and not a very nice someone either. We have to get down to Sidewinder, not just Danny, but all of us, quickly. And you're sitting there reading your play.
We have to get down, we have to get down. You keep saying that. You must think I really am Superman.
I think you're my husband,
she said softly, and looked down at her hands. His temper flared. He slammed the play script down, knocking the edges of the pile out of True again, and crumpling the sheets on the bottom. It's time you got some of the home truths into you, Wendy. You don't seem to have internalized them, as the sociologists say. They're knocking around up in your head like a bunch of loose cue balls. You need to shoot them into the pockets. You need to understand that we are snowed in. Danny had suddenly become active in his bed. Still sleeping, he had begun to twist and turn, the way he always did when he fought, Wendy thought dismally. And we're doing it again.
Don't wake him up, Jack, please. He glanced over at Danny and some of the flush went out of his cheeks.
Okay, I'm sorry. I'm sorry I sounded mad, Wendy. It's not really for you, but I broke the radio. If it's anybody's fault, it's mine. That was our big link to the outside. Ollie ollie and for free. Please come get us, Mr. Ranger. We can't stay out this late.
Don't, she said, and put a hand on his shoulder. He leaned his head against it. She brushed his hair with her other hand. I guess you've got it right, after what I accused you of. Sometimes I am like my mother. I can be a bitch. But you have to understand some things are hard to get over. You have to understand that.
Do you mean his arm?
His lips had thinned. Yes, Wendy said, and then she rushed on. But it's not just you. I worry when he goes out to play. I worry about him wanting a two-wheeler next year, even one with training wheels. I worry about his teeth and his eyesight and about this thing that he calls his shine. I worry because he's little and he seems very fragile, and because something in this hotel seems to want him. And it'll go through us to get to him if it has to. And that's why we must get him out, Jack. I know that. I feel that. We must get him out.
Her hand had tightened painfully on his shoulder in her agitation, but he didn't move away. One hand found the firm weight of her left breast, and he began to stroke it through her shirt. Wendy, he said and stopped. She waited for him to rearrange whatever he had to say. His strong hand on her breast felt good, soothing. I could maybe snowshoe him down. He could walk part of the way himself, but I would mostly have to carry him. It would mean camping out 1, 2, maybe 3 nights. That would mean building a travois to carry supplies and bedrolls on. We have the AM/FM radio, so we could pick a day when the weather forecast called for a 3-day spell of good weather. But if the forecast was wrong, he finished, his voice soft and measured, I think we might die. Her face had paled. It looked shiny, almost ghostly. He continued to stroke her breast, rubbing the ball of his thumb gently over the nipple. She made a soft sound. From his words, or in reaction to his gentle pressure on her breast, he couldn't tell. He raised his hand slightly and undid the top button of her shirt. Wendy shifted her leg slightly. All at once, her jeans seemed too tight, slightly irritating in a pleasant sort of way. It would mean leaving you alone because you can't snowshoe worth beans. It would be maybe 3 days of not knowing. Would you want that? His hand dropped to the second button, slipped it, and the beginnings of her cleavage was exposed.
No, she said in a voice that was slightly thick. She glanced over at Danny. He had stopped twisting and turning. His thumb had crept back into his mouth, so that was all right. But Jack was leaving something out of the picture. It was too bleak. There was something else. What?
If we stay put, Jack said, unbuttoning the third and fourth buttons with that same deliberate slowness. A ranger from the park or a game warden is going to poke in here just to find out how we're doing. At that point, we simply tell him we want down. He'll see to it. He slipped her naked breasts into the wide V of the open shirt, bent and molded his lips around the stem of a nipple. It was hard and erect. He slipped his tongue slowly back and forth across it in a way he knew she liked. Wendy moaned a little and arched her back. Something I've forgotten.
Honey?
She asked. On their own, her hands sought the back of his head, so that when he answered, his voice was muffled against her flesh.
How would the ranger take us out?
He raised his head slightly to answer, and then settled his mouth against the other nipple. If the helicopter was spoken for, I guess it would have to be by snowmobile.
But we have one of those. Ullman said so.
His mouth froze against her breast for a moment, and then he sat up. Her own face was slightly flushed, her eyes overbright. Jack's, on the other hand, was calm, as if he had been reading a rather dull book instead of engaging in foreplay with his wife.
If there's a snowmobile, then there's no problem, she said excitedly. We can all three go down together.
Wendy, I've never driven a snowmobile in my life.
It can't be that hard to learn. Back in Vermont, you see 10-year-olds driving them in the fields. Although what their parents can be thinking if, I don't know. And you had a motorcycle when we met.
He had a Honda 350cc. He had traded it in for a Saab shortly after that, and he and Wendy took up residence together. I suppose I could, he said slowly, but I wonder how well it's been maintained. Ullman and Watson, they run this place from May to October. They have summertime mines. I know it won't have gas in it. There may not be plugs or battery either. I don't want you to get your hopes up over your head, Wendy. She was totally excited now, leaning over him, her breast tumbling out of her shirt. He had a sudden impulse to seize one and twist it until she shrieked. Maybe that would teach her to shut up.
The gas is no problem, she said. The VW and the hotel truck are both full. There's gas for the emergency generator downstairs, too. And there must be a gas can out in that shed, so you could carry extra.
Yes, he said, there is. Actually, there were 3 of them, 2 5-gallons and a 2-gallon.
I'll bet the spark plugs and the battery are out there, too. Well, nobody would store their snowmobile in one place and the plugs and batteries someplace else, would they?
Well, it doesn't seem likely, does it? He got up and walked over to where Danny lay sleeping. A spill of hair had fallen across his forehead, and Jack brushed it away gently. Danny didn't stir.
And if you can get it running, you'll take us out? She asked from behind him. On the first day, the radio says good weather?
For a moment, he didn't answer. He stood looking down at his son, and his mixed feelings dissolved in a wave of love. He was the way she had said, vulnerable, fragile. The marks on his neck were very prominent. Yes, he said. I'll get it running, and we'll get out as quick as we can.
Thank God!
He turned around. She had taken off her shirt and lay on the bed, her belly flat, her breasts aimed perkily at the ceiling. She was playing with them lazily, flicking at the nipples.
Hurry up, gentlemen, she said softly. Time.
After, with no light burning in the room but the night light that Danny had brought with him from his room, she lay in the crook of his arm, feeling deliciously at peace. She found it hard to believe They could be sharing the overlook with a murderous stowaway.
Jack?
Mm.
What got at him?
He didn't answer her directly. He does have something. Some talent the rest of us are missing. The most of us, beg pardon. And maybe the Overlook has something too.
Ghosts?
I don't know. Not in the Algernon Blackwood sense, that's for sure. More like the residues of the feelings of the people who have stayed here. Good things and bad things. In that sense, I suppose that every big hotel has got its ghosts, especially the old ones.
But a dead woman in the tub. Jack, he's not losing his mind, is he? He gave her a brief squeeze.
Well, we know he goes into, well, trances, for want of a better word, from time to time. We know that when he's in them, he sometimes sees things he doesn't understand. If precognitive trances are possible, they're probably functions of the subconscious mind. Freud said that the subconscious never speaks to us in literal language, only in symbols. If you dream about being in a bakery where no one speaks English, you may be worried about your ability to support your family. Or maybe just that no one understands you. I've read that the falling dream is a standard outlet for feelings of insecurity. Games, little games. Conscious on one side of the net, subconscious on the other, serving some cockamamie image back and forth. Same with mental illness, with hunches, all that. Why should precognition be any different? Maybe Danny really did see blood all over the walls of the presidential suite. To a kid his age, the image of blood and the concept of death are nearly interchangeable. To kids, the image is always more accessible than the concept anyway. William Carlos Williams knew that. He was a pediatrician. When he grew up, concepts gradually get easier and we leave the images to the poets. I'm just rambling on.
I like to hear you ramble.
She said it, folks. She said it. Y'all heard it.
The marks on his neck, Jack, those are real.
Yes. There was something else for a long time. She'd begun to think he must have gone to sleep, and she was slipping into a drowse herself when he said, I can think of 2 explanations for those, and neither of them involves a 4th party in the hotel.
What?
She came up on one elbow. Stigmata, maybe? He said.
Stigmata? Isn't that when people bleed on Good Friday or something?
Yes. Sometimes people who believe deeply in Christ's divinity exhibit bleeding marks on their hands and feet during the Holy Week. It was more common in the Middle Ages than now. In those days, such people were considered blessed by God. I don't think the Catholic Church proclaimed any of it as out-and-out miracles, which is pretty smart of them. Stigmata isn't much different from some of the things the yogis can do. It's better understood now, that's all. People who understand the interaction between the mind and the body, study it, no one understands it, believe we have a lot more control over our involuntary actions and functions than they used to think. You can slow your heartbeat if you think about it enough. Speed up your own metabolism, make yourself sweat more, or make yourself bleed.
You think Danny thought those bruises onto his neck? Jack, I just can't believe that.
I can believe it's possible, although it seems unlikely to me too. What's more likely is that he did it to himself.
To himself?
He's gone into those trances and hurt himself in the past. You remember the time at the supper table about 2 years ago? We were super pissed at each other and nobody talking very much. All at once, his eyes rolled up in his head and he went face first into his dinner. Then onto the floor. You remember?
Yes, I sure do. I thought he was having a convulsion.
Another time we were in the park, just Danny and me, Saturday afternoon. He was sitting on a swing coasting back and forth, and he just collapsed onto the ground. It was like he had been shot. I ran over and I picked him up, and all of a sudden he just came around. He sort of blinked at me and said, "I hurt my tummy. Tell Mommy to close the bedroom doors if it rains." And that night it rained like hell.
Yes, but
He's always coming in with cuts and scraped elbows. His shins look like a battlefield in distress. When you ask him how he got this one or that one, he just says, "Oh, I was playing." And that's the end of it.
Jack, all kids get bumped and bruised up. With little boys, it's almost constant from the time they learn to walk until they're 12 or 13.
And I'm sure Danny gets his share, Jack responded. He's an active kid, but I remember that day in the park and that night at the supper table. I wonder if some of our kids' bumps and bruises come from just keeling over. Dr. Edmonds said Danny did it right in his office, for Christ's sake.
All right. If those bruises were fingers, I'd swear it. He didn't get those falling down.
He goes into a trance, Wendy. Maybe he sees something that happened in that room. An argument, maybe a suicide, violent emotions. It isn't like watching a movie. He's in a highly suggestible state. He's right in the damn thing. His subconscious is maybe visualizing whatever happened in a symbolic way. As a dead woman who's alive again. Zombie, undead, ghoul, you pick your term.
You're giving me goosebumps.
I'm giving myself a few. I'm no psychiatrist, Wendy, but it seems to fit so well. The walking dead woman as a symbol for dead emotions, dead lives that just won't give up and go away. And because she's a subconscious figure, she's also him. In the trance state, the conscious Danny is submerged. The subconscious figure is pulling the strings. So Danny put his hands around his own neck and...
Stop! I get the picture. I think that's more frightening than having a stranger creeping around the halls, Jack. You can move away from a stranger. You can't move away from yourself. You're talking about schizophrenia.
Of a very limited type. And of a very special nature. Because he does seem able to read thoughts, and he really does seem to have precognitive flashes from time to time. I can't think of that as a mental illness no matter how hard I try. We all have schizo deposits in us anyway, and I think as Danny gets older, he'll get his under control.
If you're right, then it's imperative that we get him out. Whatever he has, this hotel is making him worse.
I wouldn't say that. If he'd done as he was told, he never would have gone up to that room in the first place. It never would have happened.
My God, Jack. Are you implying that being half strangled was a fitting punishment for being off limits?
No, of course not. But...
No buts, she said, shaking her head violently. The truth is, we're guessing. We don't have any idea when he might turn a corner and run into one of those air pockets, one reel horror movies, whatever they are. We have to get him away. She laughed a little in the darkness. Next thing we'll be seeing things.
"Don't talk nonsense," he said, and in the darkness of the room he saw the hedge lions bunching around the path, no longer flanking it but guarding it. Hungry November lions, cold sweat sprang out on his brow.
You didn't really see anything, did you? She was asking. I mean, when you went up to that room, you didn't see anything.
The lions were gone. Now he saw a pink pastel shower curtain with a dark shape lounging behind it. The closed door. That muffled, hurried thump. And sounds after it that might have been running footsteps. The horrible, lurching beat of his own heart as he struggled with the passkey. "Nothing," he said. And that was true. He had been strung up. Not sure what was happening. He hadn't had a chance to sift through his thoughts for a reasonable explanation concerning the bruises on his son's neck. He had been pretty damn suggestible himself. Hallucinations could sometimes be catching.
And you haven't changed your mind? About the snowmobile, I mean?
His hands clamped into sudden tight fists. "Stop nagging me!" By his sides. "I said I would, didn't I? I will. Now go to sleep. It's been a long, hard day."
"And how?" she said. There was a rustle of bedclothes as she turned toward him and kissed his shoulder. "I love you, Jack."
"I love you too," he said, but he was only mouthing the words. His hands were still clenched into fists. They felt like rocks on the end of his arms. The pulse beat prominently in his forehead. She hadn't said a word about what was going to happen to them after they got down, when the party was over. Not one word. It had been Danny this and Danny that, and Jack, I'm so scared. Oh yes, she was scared of a lot of closet boogeymen and jumping shadows, plenty scared. But there was no lack of real ones either. When they got down to Sidewinder, they would arrive with $60 and the clothes they stood up in. Not even a car. Even if Sidewinder had a pawn shop, which it didn't, they had nothing to hawk but Wendy's $90 diamond engagement ring and the Sony AM/FM radio. A pawnbroker might give him $20, a kind pawnbroker. There would be no job, not even part-time or seasonal, except maybe shoveling out driveways for $3 a shot. A picture of John Torrance, 30 years old, who had once published in Esquire, and who had harbored dreams, not at all unreasonable dreams he felt, of becoming a major American writer during the next decade, with a shovel from the Sidewinder Western Auto on his shoulder, ringing doorbells. That picture suddenly came to him much more clearly than the hedge lions, and he clenched his fist tighter still, feeling the fingernails sink into his palms and draw blood in mystic quarter-moon shapes. John Torrance, standing in line to change his $60 into food stamps, standing in line again at the Sidewinder Methodist Church to get donated commodities and dirty looks from the locals. John Torrance explaining to Al that they had just had to leave. Had to shut down the boiler, had to leave the Overlook and all it contained open to vandals or thieves on snow machines because, you see, Al, attendez-vous, there are ghosts up there, and they have it in for my boy. Goodbye, Al. Thoughts of Chapter 4. Spring comes for John Torrance. What then? Whatever then. They might be able to get to the West Coast in the VW, he supposed. A new fuel pump would do it, 50 miles west of here, and it was all downhill. You could damn near put the bug in neutral and coast to Utah. On to sunny California, land of oranges and opportunity. A man with his sterling record of alcoholism, student beating, and ghost chasing would undoubtedly be able to write his own ticket. Anything you like. Custodial engineer swamping out Greyhound buses. The automotive business, washing cars in a rubber suit. Culinary arts, perhaps. Washing dishes in a diner. Or possibly a more responsible position, such as pumping gas. A job like that even held the intellectual stimulation of making change and writing out credit slips. Oh, I can give you 25 hours a week at the minimum wage. Oh, that was heavy tunes in a year when Wonder Bread went for 60 cents a loaf. Blood had begun to trickle down from his palms. Like stigmata, oh, yes. He squeezed tighter, savaging himself with pain. His wife was asleep beside him. Why not? There were no problems. He had agreed to take her and Danny away from the big bad boogeyman. And there were no problems. So you see, Al thought the best thing to do would be to kill her. The thought rose up from nowhere, naked and unadorned. The urge to tumble her out of bed, naked, bewildered, just beginning to wake up, to pounce on her, seize her neck, like the green limb of a young aspen, and to throttle her thumbs on windpipe, fingers pressing against the top of her spine, jerking her head up and ramming her back down against the floorboards. Again and again, whamming, whacking, smashing, crashing. Jitter and jive, baby, shake, rattle, and fucking roll. He would take her and make her and take her and make her take her medicine, every goddamn drop, every last bitter drop. He was dimly aware of a muffled noise somewhere, just outside his hot, racing inner world. He looked across the room, and Danny was thrashing again, twisting in his bed and rumpling the blankets. The boy was moaning deep in his throat, a small cage sound. What nightmare! A purple woman, long dead, shambling after him down twisting hotel corridors? Somehow he didn't think so. Something else chased Danny in his dreams, something worse. The bitter lock of his emotions was broken. He got out of bed and went across to the boy, feeling sick and ashamed of himself. It was Danny he had to think of, not Wendy, not himself, only Danny. No matter what shape he wrestled the facts into, he knew in his heart that Danny must be taken out. He straightened the boy's blankets and added the quilt from the foot of the bed. Danny had quieted again now. Jack touched the sleeping forehead. What monsters capering just behind that ridge of bone, and found it warm, but not overly so, and he was sleeping peacefully again. Queer. He got back into his bed and tried to sleep. It eluded him. It was so unfair that things should turn out this way. Bad luck seemed to stalk them. They hadn't been able to shake it by coming up here at all. By the time they arrived in Sidewinder tomorrow afternoon, the golden opportunity would have evaporated. Gone the way of the blue suede shoe, as an old roommate of his had been wont to say. Consider the difference if they didn't go down, if they could somehow stick it out. The play would get finished. One way or the other, he would tack on an ending to it. His own uncertainty about his characters might add an appalling or an appealing touch of ambiguity to his original ending. Perhaps it would even make him some money. It wasn't impossible. Even lacking that, Al might well convince the Stovington board to rehire him. He would be on pro, of course. Maybe for as long as 3 years. But if he could stay sober and keep writing, he might not have to stay at Stovington for 3 years. Of course, he hadn't cared much for Stovington before. He had been stifled, buried alive. But that had been an immature reaction. Furthermore, how much could a man enjoy teaching when he went through his first 3 classes with a skull-busting hangover every second or third day? It wouldn't be that way again. He wouldn't be able to handle his responsibilities much better. He was sure of it. Somewhere in the midst of that thought, things began to break up, and he drifted down into sleep. His last thought followed him down like a sounding bell. It seemed that he might be able to find peace here, at last, if they would only let him. When he woke up, he was standing in the bathroom of 217. Been walking in my sleep again. Why? No radios to break up here. The bathroom light was on, the room behind him in darkness. The shower curtain was drawn around the long claw-footed tub. The bath mat beside it was wrinkled and wet. He began to feel afraid, but the very dreamlike quality of his fear told him this was not real. Yes, that could not contain the fear. So many things at the Overlook seemed like dreams. He moved across the floor to the tub, not wanting to, but helpless to turn his feet back. He flung the curtain open. Lying in the tub, naked, lolling almost weightless in the water, was George Hatfield, a knife stuck in his chest. The water around him was stained a bright pink. George's eyes were closed. His penis floated limply like kelp. George, he heard himself say. At the word, George's eyes snapped open. They were silver. Not human eyes at all. George's hands, fish white, found the sides of the tub, and he pulled himself up to a sitting position. The knife stuck straight out from his chest, equidistantly placed between nipples. The wound was lipless. You set the timer ahead, silver-eyed George told him. No, George, I didn't. I don't stutter. George was standing now, still fixing him with that inhuman silver glare. But his mouth had drawn back in a dead and grimacing smile. He threw one leg over the porcelain side of the tub. One white and wrinkled foot placed itself in the bath mat. First you tried to run me over on my bike, and then you set the timer ahead, and then you tried to stab me to death, but I still don't stutter. George was coming for him, his hands out, the fingers slightly curled. He smelled moldy and wet, like leaves that had been rained on. It was for your own good, Jack said, backing up. I set it ahead for your own good. Furthermore, I happen to know you cheated on your final composition. I don't cheat, and I don't stutter. George's hands touched his neck. Jack turned and ran with the floating, weightless slowness that is so common in dreams. You did cheat, he screamed in fear and anger as he crossed the darkened bed sitting room. I'll prove it. George's hands were on his neck again. Jack's heart swelled with fear until he was sure he would burst. And then at last his hand curled around the doorknob, and it turned under his hand, and he yanked the door open. He plunged out, not into the second-floor hallway, but into the basement room beyond the arch. The cobwebby light was on. His camp chair, stark and geometrical, stood beneath it, and all around it was a miniature mountain range of boxes and crates and banded bundles of records and invoices and God knew what. Relief surged through him. I'll find it, he heard himself screaming. He seized a damp and moldering cardboard box. It split apart in his hands, spilling out a waterfall of yellow flimsies. It's here somewhere, I'll find it. He plunged his hands deep into the pile of papers and came up with a dry, papery wasp's nest in one hand and a timer in the other. The timer was ticking. Attached to his back was a length of electrical cord, and attached to the other end of the cord was a bundle of dynamite. Here, he screamed. Here, take it. His relief became absolute triumph. He had done more than escape George. He had conquered. With these talismanic objects in his hands, George would never touch him again. George would flee in terror. He began to turn so he could confront George. And that was when George's hands settled around his neck, squeezing. Stopping his breath, damming up his respiration entirely after one final dragging gasp. I don't stutter, whispered George from behind him. He dropped the wasp's nest, and wasps boiled out of it into a furious brown and yellow wave. His lungs were on fire. His wavering sight fell on the timer, and the sense of triumph returned. along with a cresting wave of righteous wrath. Instead of connecting the timer to dynamite, the cord ran to the gold knob of a stout black cane, like the one his father had carried after the accident with the milk truck. He grasped it, and the cord parted. The cane felt heavy and right in his hands. He swung it back over his shoulder. On the way up, it glanced against the wire from which the light bulb depended, and the light began to swing back and forth, making the room's hooded shadows rock monstrously against the floor and walls. On the way down, the cane struck something much harder. George screamed. The grip on Jack's throat loosened. He tore free of George's grip and whirled. George was on his knees, his head drooping, his hands laced together on top of it. Blood welled through his fingers. "Please," George whispered humbly. "Give me a break, Mr. Torrance." "Now you'll take your medicine," Jack grunted. "Now, by God, won't you, young pup? Young, worthless cur. Now, by God, right now. Every drop, every single damn drop." As the light swayed above him and the shadows danced and flapped, he began to swing the cane, bringing it down again and again, his arm rising and falling like a machine. George's bloody protecting fingers fell away from his head, and Jack brought the cane down again, and on his neck and shoulders and back and arms, except that the cane was no longer precisely a cane. It seemed to be a mallet with some kind of brightly striped handle, a mallet with a hard side and a soft side. The business end was clotted with blood and hair, and the flat whacking sound of the mallet against flesh had been replaced with a hollow booming sound, echoing and reverberating. His own voice had taken on the same quiet quality, bellowing, disembodied, and yet paradoxically, it sounded weaker, slurred, petulant, as if he were drunk. The figure on its knees slowly raised its head, as if in supplication. There was not a face precisely, but only a mask of blood, through which eyes peered. He brought the mallet back for a final whistling downstroke, and it was fully launched before he saw that the supplicating face below him was not George's, but Danny's. It was the face of his son.
"Daddy!"
And then the mallet crashed home, striking Danny right between the eyes, closing them forever. And something, somewhere, seemed to be laughing. "No!" He came out of it standing naked over Danny's bed, his hands empty, his body sheened with sweat. His final scream had only been in his mind. He voiced it again, this time in a whisper. "No. No, Danny. Ever." He went back to bed on legs that had turned to rubber. Wendy was sleeping deeply. The clock on the nightstand said that it was 5:15. He lay sleepless until 7, when Danny began to stir awake. Then he put his legs over the edge of the bed and began to dress. It was time to go downstairs and check the boiler. Chapter 33. The Snowmobile. Sometime after midnight, while they all slept uneasily, the snow had stopped after dumping a fresh 8 inches on the old crust. Clouds had broken, a fresh wind had swept them away, and now Jack stood in a dusty ingot of sunlight, which slanted through the dirty window into the eastern side of the equipment shed. The place was about as long as a freight car and about as high. It smelled of grease and oil and gasoline and faint nostalgic smell of sweet grass. 4 power lawnmowers were ranked like soldiers on review against the south wall. 2 of them, the riding type that looked like small tractors. To their left were post hole diggers, round-bladed shovels made for doing surgery on the putting green, a chainsaw, the electric hedge clippers, and a long, thin steel pole with a red flag at the top. "Caddy, fetch my ball in under 10 seconds, and there's a quarter in it for you." "Yes, sir." Against the eastern wall, where the morning sun slanted most strongly, 3 ping-pong tables leaned one against the other like a drunken house of cards. Their nets had been removed and flopped down from the shelf above. In the corner was a stack of shuffleboard weights and a rope set. The wickets banded together with twists of wire, the brightly painted balls, and an egg carton sort of thing. "Strange hens you have up here, Watson." "Yes, and you see the animals down on the front lawn, ha. And the mallets, 2 sets of them, standing in their racks." He walked over to them, stepping over an old 8-cell battery, which had once sat beneath the hood of the hotel truck, no doubt, and a battery charger and a pair of J.C. Penney jumper cables coiled between them. He slipped one of the short-handled mallets out of the front rack and held it up in front of his face, like a knight bound for battle saluting his king. Fragments of his dream, it was all jumbled now, fading, recurred, something about George Hatfield and his father's cane. Just enough to make him uneasy, and absurdly enough, a trifle guilty about holding a plain old garden variety roque mallet. Not that roque was such a common garden variety game anymore. Its more modern cousin, croquet, was much more popular now, and a child's version of that game, and a game of roque, however, that must have been quite a game. Jack had found a mildewed rule book down in the basement from one of the years in the early 20s when a North American roque tournament had been held at the Overlook. Quite a game. Schizo. He frowned a little, then smiled. Yes, it was a schizo sort of a game at that. The mallet expressed that perfectly, a soft end and a hard end. A game of finesse and aim, and a game of raw, bludgeoning power. He swung the mallet through the air. Whoop! He smiled a little at the powerful whistling sound it made. Then he replaced it in the rack and turned to his left. What he saw there made him frown again. The snowmobile sat almost in the middle of the equipment shed, a fairly new one. And Jack didn't care for its looks at all. The Bombardier Skidoo was written on the side of the engine, cowling, facing him in black letters, which had been raked backward, presumably to connote speed. The protruding skis were also black. There was black piping to the right and left of the cowling, what they would call racing stripes on a sports car. But the actual paint job was a bright, sneering yellow, and that was what he didn't like about it. Sitting there in its shaft of morning sun, yellow body and black piping, black skis, and a black upholstered open cockpit, it looked like a monstrous mechanized wasp. When it was running, it would sound like that too, whining and buzzing and ready to sting. But then, what else should it look like? It wasn't flying under false colors, at least, because after it had done its job, they were going to be hurting plenty, all of them. By spring, the Torrance family would be hurting so badly that what those wasps had done to Danny's hand would look like a mother's kisses. He pulled his handkerchief from his back pocket, wiped his mouth with it, and walked over to the skidoo. He stood looking over down at it, the frown very deep now, and stuffed his handkerchief into his back pocket. Outside, a sudden gust of wind slammed against the equipment shed, making it rock and creak. He looked out the window and saw the gust carrying a sheet of sparkling snow crystals toward the drifted in rear of the hotel, whirling them high into the hard blue sky. The wind dropped, and he went back to looking at the machine. It was a disgusting thing, really. You almost expected to see a long, limber stinger protruding from the rear of it. He'd always disliked the goddamn snowmobiles. They shivered the cathedral silence of winter into a million rattling fragments. They startled the wildlife. They sent out huge and pollutive clouds of blue and billowing oil smoke behind them. Let me breathe. They were perhaps the final grotesque toy of the unwinding fossil fuel age, given to 10-year-olds for Christmas. He remembered a newspaper article he had read in Stovington, a story dateline someplace in Maine. A kid on a snowmobile barrel-assing up a road he'd never traveled before at better than 30 miles an hour. Night, his headlight off. There had been a heavy chain strung between two posts with a no trespassing sign hung from the middle. They said that in all probability the kid never saw it. The moon might have been behind a cloud. The chain had decapitated him. Reading the story, Jack had been almost glad, and now, looking down at this machine, the feeling recurred. If it wasn't for Danny, I'd take great pleasure in grabbing one of those mallets, opening the cowling, and just pounding until... He let his pent-up breath escape him in a long, slow sigh. Wendy was right. Come hell, high water, or the welfare line, Wendy was right. Pounding this machine to death would be the height of folly, no matter how pleasant an aspect that folly made. It would almost be tantamount to pounding his own son to death. Fucking Luddite, he said aloud. He went to the back of the machine and unscrewed the gas cap. He found a dipstick on one of the shelves that ran at chest height along the walls and slipped it in. The last eighth of an inch came out wet. Not very much, but enough to see if the damn thing would run. Later, he could siphon more from the Volks and the hotel truck. He screwed the cap back on and opened the cowling. No spark plugs, no battery. He went to the shelf again and began to poke along it, pushing aside screwdrivers and adjustable wrenches, a one-lung carburetor that had been taken out of the old lawnmower, plastic boxes of screws and nails and bolts of varying sizes. The shelf was thick and dark with old grease, and the year's accumulation of dust had stuck to it like fur. He didn't like touching it. He found a small oil-stained box with the abbreviation SKID laconically marked on it in pencil. He shook it and something rattled inside. Plugs. He held one of them up to the light, trying to estimate the gap without hunting around for the gapping tool. Fuck it, he thought resentfully, and dropped the plug back into the box. If the gap's wrong, well, that's just too damn bad. Tough fucking titty. There was a stool behind the door. He dragged it over, sat down, and installed the 4 spark plugs, then fitted the small rubber caps over each. That done, he let his fingers play briefly over the magneto. They laughed when I sat down at the piano. Back to the shelves. This time we couldn't find what he wanted, a small battery, 3 or 4 cell. There were socket wrenches, a case filled with drills and drill bits, bags of lawn fertilizer, and Vigoro for the flower beds. But no snowmobile battery. It didn't bother him in the slightest. In fact, it made him feel glad. He was relieved. I did my best, Captain, but I could not get through.
Well, that's fine, son. I'm going to put you in the Silver Star and the Purple Snowmobile. You're a credit to your regiment.
Thank you, sir. I did try. He began to whistle Red River Valley, up-tempo as he poked along the last 2 or 3 feet of shelf. The notes came out in little puffs of white smoke. He had made a complete circuit of the shed, and the thing wasn't there. Maybe somebody had lifted it. Maybe Watson had. He laughed aloud, the old office bootleg trick. A few paper clips, a couple of reams of paper. Nobody will miss the tablecloth or this golden regal place setting. And what about this fine snowmobile battery? Yes, that might come in handy. Toss it in the sack. White collar crime, baby. Everybody has sticky fingers. Under the jacket discount, we used to call it when we were kids. He walked back to the snowmobile and gave the side of it a good healthy kick as he went by. Well, that was the end of it. He would just have to tell Wendy, sorry, baby, but... There was a box sitting in the corner by the door. The stool had been right over it. Written on the top in pencil was the abbreviation SKID. He looked at it, a smile drying up on his lips. Look, sir, it's the cavalry. Looks like your smoke signals must have worked after all. It wasn't fair. God damn it just wasn't fair. Something, luck, fate, providence, had been trying to save him. Some other luck, white luck. And at the last moment, bad old Jack Torrance's luck had stepped back in. The lousy run of cards wasn't over yet. Resentment, a gray, sullen wave of it, pushed up his throat. His hands had clenched into fists again. Not fair, goddammit, not fair! Why couldn't he have looked someplace else? Any place? Why hadn't he had a crick in his neck, or an itch in his nose, or the need to blink? Just one of those little things. He never would have seen it. Well, he hadn't. That was all. It was a hallucination. No different from what had happened yesterday outside that room on the 2nd floor of the goddamn Hedge Menagerie. A momentary strain, that was all. Fancy I thought I saw a snowmobile battery in that corner. Nothing there now. Combat fatigue, I guess, sir. Sorry, keep your pecker up, son. Happens to all of us sooner or later. He yanked the door open almost hard enough to snap the hinges and pulled his snowshoes inside. They were clotted with snow, and he slapped them down hard enough on the floor to raise a cloud of it. He put his left foot on the left shoe and paused. Danny was out there, by the milk platform, trying to make a snowman by the looks. Not much luck. Snow was too cold to stick together. Still, he was giving it the old college try, out there in the flashing morning. Speck a bundled up boy above the brilliant snow and below the brilliant sky, wearing his hat turned around backwards like Carlton Fisk. What in the name of God were you thinking of? The answer came back with no pause. Me. I was thinking of me. He suddenly remembered lying in bed the night before, lying there, and suddenly he had been contemplating the murder of his wife. In that instant, kneeling there, everything had come clear to him. It was not just Danny the Overlook was working on, it was working on him too. It wasn't Danny who was the weak link, it was him. He was the vulnerable one, the one who who could be bent and twisted until something snapped, until I let go and sleep. And when I do that, if I do that... He looked up at the bank's windows, and the sun threw back an almost blinding glare from their many-paned surfaces. But he looked anyway. For the first time, he noticed how much they seemed like eyes. They reflected away the sun and held their own darkness within. It was not Danny they were looking at. It was him. In those few seconds, he understood everything. There was a certain black and white picture he remembered seeing as a child in catechism class. The nun had presented it to them on an easel and called it a miracle of God. The class had looked at it blankly, seeing nothing but a jumble of whites and blacks, senseless and patternless. Then one of the children in the third row had gasped, "It's Jesus!" And that child had gone home with a brand new testament, and also a calendar because he had been the first. The others stared even harder, Jackie Torrance among them. One by one, the other kids had given a similar gasp, one little girl transported in near ecstasy, crying out shrilly, "I see him! I see him!" She had also been rewarded with a testament. At last everyone had seen the face of Jesus in the jumble of blacks and whites except Jackie. He strained harder and harder, scared now, part of him cynically thinking that everyone else was simply putting on to please Sister Beatrice, part of him secretly convinced that he wasn't seeing it because God had decided he was the worst sinner in the class. "Don't you see it, Jackie?" Sister Beatrice had asked him in her sad, sweet manner. "I see your tits," he had thought in vicious desperation. He began to shake his head, then faked excitement and said, "Yes, I do. Wow, it is Jesus." And everyone in class had laughed and applauded him, making him feel triumphant, ashamed, and scared. Later, when everyone else had tumbled their way up from the church basement and out onto the street, he had lingered behind, looking at the meaningless black and white jumble that Sister Beatrice had left on the easel. He hated it. They'd all made it up the way he had, even Sister herself. It was a big fake. "Shitfire, hellfire, shitfire," he had whispered under his breath. And as he turned to go, he had seen the face of Jesus from the corner of his eye, sad and wise. He turned back, his heart in his throat. Everything had suddenly clicked into place, and he had stared at the picture with fearful wonder, unable to believe that he had missed it. The eyes, the zigzag of shadow across the careworn brow, the fine nose, the compassionate lips, looking at Jackie Torrance. What had only been a meaningless sprawl had suddenly been transformed into stark black and white etching of the face of Christ our Lord. Leonardo. Fearful wonder became terror. He had cussed in front of a picture of Jesus. He would be damned. He would be in hell with the sinners. The face of Christ had been in the picture all along. All along. Now, kneeling in the sun and watching his son playing in the shadow of the hotel, he knew that it was all true. The hotel wanted Danny. Maybe all of them, but Danny for sure. The Hedges had really walked. There was a dead woman in 217. A woman that was perhaps only a spirit, but harmless under most circumstances, but a woman who was now in active danger. Like some malevolent clockwork toy, she had been wound up and set in motion by Danny's own mind. And his own. Had it been Watson, who had told him a man had dropped dead of a stroke one day on the rope court? Or had it been Ullman? It didn't matter. There had been an assassination on the third floor. How many old quarrels, suicides, strokes? How many murders? Was Grady lurking somewhere in the West Wing with his axe, just waiting for Danny to start up so he could come back and out of the woodwork? The puffed circle of bruises around Danny's neck, the twinkling half-seen bottles in the deserted lounge, the radio, the dreams, the scrapbook he had found in the cellar.
Medoc, are you there? I've been sleepwalking again, my dear.
He got up suddenly, thrusting the snowshoes back out of the door. He was shaking all over. He slammed the door and picked up the box with a battery in it. He slipped through his shaking fingers. Oh, Christ, what if I cracked it? And thumped over on its side. He pulled the flaps of the carton open and yanked the battery out, heedless of the acid that might be leaking through the battery's casing if it had cracked. But it hadn't. It was whole. A little sigh escaped his lips. Cradling it, he took it over to the skidoo and put it on its platform near the front of the engine. He found a small adjustable wrench on one of the shelves and attached the battery cables quickly and with no trouble. The battery was live. No need to use a charger on it. There had been a crackle of electricity and a small odor of ozone when he slipped the positive cable into its terminal. The job done, he stood away, wiping his hands nervously on his faded denim jacket. There. That should work. No reason why not. No reason at all, except that it was part of the Overlook, and the Overlook really didn't want them out there. Didn't want them out of here, not at all. The Overlook was having one hell of a good time. There was a little boy to terrorize, a man and his woman to set against each other, and if it played its cards right, well, they could end up flitting through the Overlook's halls like insubstantial shades in a Shirley Jackson novel, whatever walked in Hill House walked alone. But you wouldn't be alone in the Overlook, oh no. There would be plenty of company here. But there was really no reason why the snowmobile shouldn't start. Except, of course.
Except he still didn't really want to go.
Yes, except for that. He stood looking at the skidoo, his breath puffing out in frozen little plumes. He wanted it to be the way it had been. When he had come in here, he'd had no doubts. Going down would be the wrong decision. He had known that then. Wendy was only scared of the boogeyman, summoned up by a single hysterical little boy. Now, suddenly he could see her side. It was like his play, his damnable play. He no longer knew which side he was on, or how things should come out. Once you saw the face of a god in those jumbled blacks and whites, it was everybody out of the pool. You could never unsee it. Others might laugh and say it's nothing, just a lot of splotches with no meaning. Give me a good old Craftmaster paint by the numbers any day. But you would be always able to see the face of Christ our Lord looking out at you. You had seen it in one gestalt leap, the conscious and unconscious melding in that one shocking moment of understanding. You would always see it. You were damned to always see it.
I've been sleepwalking again, my dear.
It had been all right until he had seen Danny playing in the snow. It was Danny's fault. Everything had been Danny's fault. He was the one with the shining or whatever it was. It wasn't a shining, it was a curse. If he and Wendy had been here alone, well, they could have passed the winter quite nicely. No pain, no strain on the brain.
Don't want to leave?
Can't? The Overlook didn't want them to go, and he didn't want them to go either. Not even Danny. Maybe he was a part of it now. Perhaps the Overlook, large and rambling Samuel Johnson that it was, had picked him to be its Boswell. You say the new caretaker writes? Very good. Sign him on. Time we told our side. Let's get rid of the woman and his snot-nosed little kid first. We don't want him to be distracted. We don't. He was standing by the snowmobile's cockpit. His head started to ache again. What did it come down to? Go or stay? Very simple. Keep it simple. Shall we go or shall we stay? If we go, how long will it be before you find the local hole and sidewinder? A voice inside him asked. The dark place with the lousy color TV that unshaven and unemployed men spend the day watching game shows on. Where the piss in the men's room smells 2,000 years old. There's always a sudden camel butt unraveling in the toilet bowl. Where the beer is 30 cents a glass, and you cut it with salt. And the jukebox is loaded with 70 country oldies. How long? Oh, Christ, he was so afraid it wouldn't be long at all. I can't win, he said, very softly. And that was it. It was like trying to play solitaire with one of the aces missing from the deck. Abruptly, he leaned over the skidoo's motor compartment and yanked off the magneto. It came off with sickening ease. He looked at it for a moment, then went to the equipment shed's back door and opened it. From here, the view of the mountains was unobstructed, picture postcard beautiful in the twinkling brightness of morning. An unbroken field of snow rose to the first pines about a mile distant. He flung the magneto as far out into the snow as he could. It went much farther than it should have. There was a light puff of snow when it fell. The light breeze carried the snow granules away to fresh resting places. Disperse there, I say. There's nothing to see. It's all over. Disperse. He felt at peace. He stood in the doorway for a long time, breathing the good mountain air. When he closed it firmly and went back out the other door to tell Wendy they would be staying, on the way he stopped and had a snowball fight with Danny. Chapter 34. The Hedges. It was November 29th, 3 days after Thanksgiving. The last week had been a good one. Thanksgiving dinner, the best they had ever had as a family. Wendy had cooked Dick Halloran's turkey to a turn. They had all eaten to bursting without even coming close to demolishing the jolly bird. Jack had groaned that they would be eating turkey for the rest of the winter. Creamed turkey, turkey sandwiches, turkey and noodles, turkey surprise. No, Wendy told him with a little smile. Only until Christmas. Then we have the capon. Jack and Danny groaned together. The bruises on Danny's neck had faded, and their fears seemed to have faded with them. On Thanksgiving afternoon, Wendy had been pulling Danny around on his sled while Jack worked on the play, which was now almost done.
"Are you still afraid, Doc?"
she had asked, not knowing how to put the question less baldly.
"Yes,"
he answered simply.
"but now I stay in the safe places. Your daddy says that sooner or later the forest rangers will wonder why we're not checking in on the CB radio. They'll come to see if anything is wrong. We might go down then, you and I, and let your daddy finish the winter. He has good reasons for wanting to. In a way, Doc, I know this is hard for you to understand. Our backs are against the wall. Yes,
he had answered noncommittally. On this sparkling afternoon, the two of them went upstairs, and Danny knew that they had been making love. They were dozing now. They were happy, he knew. His mother was still a little bit afraid, but his father's attitude was strange. It was a feeling that he had done something that was very hard and had done it right. But Danny could not seem to see exactly what the something was. His father was guarding that carefully, even in his own mind. Was it possible, Danny wondered, to be glad you had done something and still be so ashamed of that something that you had tried not to think of it? The question was a disturbing one. He didn't think such a thing was possible in a normal mind. His hardest probings at his father had only brought him a dim picture of something like an octopus whirling up into the hard blue sky, and on both occasions that he had concentrated hard enough to get this, Daddy had suddenly been staring at him in a sharp and frightening way, as if he knew what Danny was doing. Now he was in the lobby, getting ready to go out. He went out a lot, taking his sled or wearing his snowshoes. He liked to get out of the hotel. When he was out in the sunshine, it seemed like a weight had slipped from his shoulders. He pulled a chair over, stood on it, and got his parka and snow pants out of the ballroom closet, and then sat down on the chair to put them on. His boots were in the boot box, and he pulled them on, his tongue creeping out into the corner of his mouth in concentration as he laced them, and tied the rawhide into careful granny knots. He pulled on his mitten and his ski mask and was ready. He tramped out through the kitchen to the back door, then paused. He was tired of playing up back, and at this time of day the hotel's shadow would be cast over his play area. He didn't even like being in the overlook shadow. He decided he would put on his snowshoes and go down to the playground instead. Dick Halloran had told him to stay away from the topiary, but the thought of the hedge animals did not bother him much. They were buried under snowdrifts now, nothing showing but a vague hump that was the rabbit's head and the lion's tails. Sticking out of the snow the way they were, the tails looked more absurd than frightening. Danny opened the back door and got his snowshoes from the milk platform. 5 minutes later, he was strapping them to his feet on the front porch. His daddy had told him that he, Danny, had the hang of using the snowshoes, the lazy shuffling stride, the twist of ankle that shook the powdery snow from the lacings just before the boot came back down. And all that remained was for him to build up the necessary muscles in his thighs and calves and ankles. Danny found that his ankles got tired the fastest. Snowshoeing was almost as hard on your ankles as skating, because you had to keep clearing the lacings. Every 5 minutes or so he had to stop with his legs spread and the snowshoes flat on the snow to rest them. But he didn't have to rest on his way down to the playground because it was all downhill. Less than 10 minutes after he struggled up and over the monstrous snow dune that had drifted in on the overlook's front porch, he was standing with his mittened hand on the playground slide. He wasn't even breathing hard. The playground seemed much nicer in the deep snow than it had ever had during the autumn. It looked like a fairyland sculpture. The swing chains had been frozen in strange positions, the seats of the big kids' swings resting flush against the snow. The jungle gym was an ice cave guarded by dripping icicle teeth. Only the chimneys of the play overlook, stuck up over the snow. Wish the other one was buried that way, only not with us in it. And the tops of the cement rings protruded in 2 places like Eskimo igloos. Danny tramped over there, squatted, and began to dig. Before long, he had uncovered the dark mouth of one of them, and he had slipped into the cold tunnel. In his mind, he was Patrick McGowan, the secret agent. They had shown the reruns of the program twice on the Burlington TV channel, and his daddy never missed them. He would skip a party to stay home and watch Secret Agent or The Avengers,
and Danny had always watched with him. On the run from KGB agents in the mountains of Switzerland. There had been avalanches in the area, and the notorious KGB agent Slabo had killed his girlfriend with a poisoned dart. But somewhere near was the Russian anti-gravity machine, perhaps at the end of this very tunnel. He drew his automatic and went along the concrete tunnel, his eyes wide and alert, his breath pluming out. The far end of the concrete ring was solidly blocked with snow. He tried digging through it and was amazed and a little uneasy to see how solid it was, almost like ice from the cold and the constant weight of more snow on top of it. His make-believe game collapsed around him, and he was suddenly aware that he felt closed in and extremely nervous in this tight ring of cement. He could hear his breathing. It sounded dank and quick and hollow. He was under the snow, and hardly any light filtered down the hole that he had dug to get in here. Suddenly, he wanted to be out in the sunlight more than anything. Suddenly, he remembered his daddy and mommy were sleeping and didn't know where he was. That if the hole he dug caved in, he would be trapped, and the Overlook didn't like him. Danny got turned around with some difficulty and crawled back along the length of the concrete ring, his snowshoes clacking woodenly together behind him, his palms crackling in last fall's dead aspen leaves beneath him. He had just reached the end, and the cold spill of light coming down from above when the snow did give in, a minor fall, but enough to powder his face and clog the opening he had wriggled down through and leave him in darkness. For a moment his brain froze in utter panic, and he could not think. Then, as if from far off, he heard his daddy telling him that he must never play at the Stovington dump, because sometimes stupid people hauled out old refrigerators off to the dump without removing the doors, and if you got in one, and the door happened to shut on you, there was no way to get out. You would die in the darkness. You wouldn't want a thing like that to happen to you, would you, Doc? No, Daddy.
But it had happened, his frenzied mind told him. It had happened. He was in the dark. He was closed in, and it was as cold as a refrigerator. And
something is in here with me.
His breath stopped in a gasp. An almost drowsy terror stole through his veins. Yes, there was something in here with him. Some awful thing the Overlook had saved for just such a chance as this. Maybe a huge spider that had burrowed down under the dead leaves, or a rat, or maybe the corpse of some little kid that had died here on the playground. Had that ever happened? Yes, he thought maybe it had. He thought of the woman in the tub, the blood and brains on the wall of the presidential suite, of some little kid, its head split open from a fall from the monkey bars or a swing, crawling after him in the dark, grinning, looking for one final playmate in its endless playground. Forever. In a moment he would hear it coming. At the far end of the concrete ring, Danny heard the stealthy crackle of dead leaves as something came for him on its hands and knees. At any moment, he would feel its cold hand close over his ankle. That thought broke his paralysis. He was digging at the loose fall of snow that choked the end of the concrete ring, throwing it back between his legs in powdery bursts like a dog digging for a bone. Blue light filtered down from above, and Danny thrust himself up at it like a diver coming out of deep water. He scraped his back on the lip of the concrete ring. One of his snowshoes twisted behind the other. Snow spilled down inside his ski mask and into the collar of his parka. He dug at the snow, clawed at it. It seemed to be trying to hold him, to suck him back down, back into the concrete ring where that unseen leaf-crackling thing was, and keep him there forever. Then he was out. His face was turned up to the sun, and he was crawling through the snow, crawling away from the half-buried cement ring, gasping harshly, his face almost comically white with powdered snow, a living fright mask. He hobbled over to the jungle gym and sat down to readjust his snowshoes and get his breath. As he set them to rights and tightened the straps again, he never took his eyes away from the hole at the end of the concrete ring. He waited to see if something would come out. Nothing did, and after 3 or 4 minutes, Danny's breathing began to slow down. Whatever it was, it couldn't stand the sunlight. It was cooped up down there, maybe only able to come out when it was dark, or when both ends of its circular prison were plugged with snow. But I'm safe now, I'm safe. I'll just go back because now I'm... Something thumped softly behind him. He turned around toward the hotel and looked. But even before he looked, can you see the Indians in this picture? He knew what he would see, because he knew what the soft thumping sound had been. It was the sound of a large clump of snow falling, the way it sounded when it slid off the roof of the hotel and fell to the ground. Can you see? Yes, he could. The snow had fallen off the hedgehog. When he came down, it had only been a harmless lump of snow outside the playground. Now it stood revealed, an incongruous splash of green and all the eye-watering whiteness. It was sitting up, as if to beg a sweet or a scrap. But this time he wouldn't go crazy. He wouldn't blow his cool, because at least he wasn't trapped in some dark old hole. He was in the sunlight, and it was just a dog. It's pretty warm out today, he thought hopefully. Maybe the sun just melted enough snow off the old dog so the rest fell off in a bunch. Maybe that's all it is.
Don't go near that place. Steer right clear.
His snowshoe bindings were as tight as they were ever going to be. He stood up and stared back at the concrete ring, almost completely submerged in the snow. And what he saw at the end, he had exited from, froze his heart. There was a circular patch of darkness at the end of it, a fold of shadow that marked the hole he dug to get down inside. Now, in spite of the snow dazzle, he thought that he could see something there, something moving, a hand, the waving hand of some desperately unhappy child, waving hand, pleading hand, drowning hand.
Save me, oh please save me. If you can't save me, at least come play with me. Forever and ever and forever.
No, Danny whispered huskily. The word fell dry and bare from his mouth, which was stripped of moisture, much like mine. He could feel his mind wavering now, trying to go away the way it had when the woman in the room had. No, better not think of that. Excuse me. He grasped at the strings of reality and held them tightly. He had to get out of here. Concentrate on that. Be cool. Be like the secret agent man. Would Patrick McGowan be crying and peeing in his pants like a little baby? Would his daddy? That calmed him somewhat. From behind him, that soft flump sound of falling snow came again. He turned around, and the head of one of the hedge lions was sticking out of the snow now, snarling at him. It was closer than it should have been, almost up to the gate of the playground. Terror tried to rise up, and he quelled it. He was the secret agent man, and he would escape. He began to walk out of the playground, taking the same roundabout course his father had taken on the day that the snow flew. He concentrated on operating the snowshoes, slow, flat strides. Don't lift your foot too high or you'll lose balance. Twist your ankle and spill the snow off the crisscrossed lacings. It seems so slow. He reached the corner of the playground. The snow was drifted high there, and he was able to step over the fence. He got halfway over and then almost fell flat when the snowshoe on his behind foot caught on one of the fence posts. He leaned on the outside edge of gravity, pinwheeling his arms, remembering how hard it was to get up once you fell down. From his right, that soft sound again. Falling clumps of snow. He looked over and saw the other two lions, clear of snow now, down to their forepaws, side by side, about 60 paces away. The green indentations that were their eyes were fixed on him. The dog had turned its head. It only happens when you're not looking.
Oh, hey!
His snowshoes had crossed, and he plunged forward into the snow, arms waving uselessly. More snow got inside his hood, down his neck, and into the tops of his boots. He struggled out of the snow and tried to get the snowshoes under him, heart hammering crazily now.
Secret agent, man, remember you're the secret agent.
And overbalanced backward. For a moment, he lay there looking at the sky, thinking it would be simpler to just give up. Then he thought of the thing in the concrete tunnel and knew he could not. He gained his feet and stared over at the topiary. All three lions were bunched together now, not 40 feet away. The dog had ranged off to their left, as if to block Danny's retreat. They were bare of snow except for powdery ruffs around their necks and muzzles. They were all staring at him. His breath was racing now, and the panic was like a rat behind his forehead, twisting and gnawing. He fought the panic, and he fought the snowshoes. Daddy's voice. No, don't fight them, Doc. Walk on them like they were your own feet. Walk with them.
Yes, Daddy.
He began to walk, trying to regain the easy rhythm he had practiced with his daddy. Little by little it began to come, but with the rhythm came an awkwardness or an awareness of just how tired he was, how much his fear had exhausted him. The tendons of his thighs and calves and ankles were hot and trembly. Ahead he could see the overlook, mockingly distant, seeming to stare at him with its many windows, as if this were some sort of contest in which it was mildly interested. Danny looked back over his shoulder, and his hurried breathing caught for a moment, and then hurried on even faster. The nearest lion was now only 20 feet behind, breasting through the snow like a dog paddling in a pond. The two others were to its right and left, pacing it. They were like an army platoon on patrol. The dog, still off to their left, the scout. The closest lion had its head down, the shoulders bunched powerfully above its neck. The tail was up, as if in the instant before he had turned to look, it had been swishing back and forth. Back and forth. He thought it looked like a great big house cat that was having a good time playing with a mouse before killing it. Falling. No, if he fell, he was dead. They would never let him get back up. They would pounce. He pinwheeled his arms madly and lunged ahead, his center of gravity dancing just beyond his nose. He caught it and hurried on, snapping glances back over his shoulder. The air whistled in and out of his dry throat like hot glass. The world closed down to the dazzling snow, the green hedges and the whispery sound of his snowshoes. And something else. A soft, muffled padding sound. He tried to hurry faster and he couldn't. He was walking over the buried driveway now, a small boy with his face almost buried in the shadow of his parka hood. The afternoon was still and bright. When he looked back again, the point lion was only 5 feet behind. It was grinning. Its mouth was open, its haunches tensed down like a clock spring. Behind it and the others, Behind it and the others, he could see the rabbit, its head now sticking out of the snow bright green, as if it had turned its horrid blank face to watch the end of the stalk. Now, on the Overlook's front lawn, between the circular drive and the porch, he let the panic loose and began to run clumsily in the snowshoes, not daring to look back now, tilting farther and farther forward, his arms out ahead of him like a blind man feeling their obstacles. His hood fell back, revealing his complexion paste white, giving way to hectic red blotches on his cheeks, his eyes bulging with terror. The porch was very close now. Behind him, he heard the sudden hard crunch of snow as something leaped. He fell on the porch steps, screaming without sound, and scrambled up them on his hands and knees, snowshoes clattering and askew behind him. There was a slashing sound in the air and a sudden pain in his leg, the ripping sound of cloth. Something else must have been on his mind. Bellowing, angry roar. Smell of blood and evergreen. He fell full length on the porch, sobbing hoarsely, the rich metallic taste of copper in his mouth. His heart was thundering in his chest. There was a small trickle of blood coming from his nose. He had no idea how long he lay there before the lobby doors flew open and Jack ran out, wearing just his jeans and a pair of slippers. Wendy was behind him. "Danny!" she screamed. "Doc, Danny, for Christ's sake! What's wrong? What happened?" Daddy was helping him up. Below the knee, his snow pants were ripped open. Inside, his woolen ski sock had been ripped open, and his calf had been shallowly scratched, as if he had tried to push his way through a closely grown evergreen hedge and the branches had clawed him. He looked over his shoulder. Far down the lawn, past the putting green, were a number of vague snow-cowled humps. The hedge animals. Between them and the playground. Between them and the road. His legs gave way. Jack caught him. He began to cry. Chapter 35. The Lobby. He had told them everything except what had happened to him when the snow had blocked the end of the concrete ring. He couldn't bring himself to repeat that, and he didn't know the right words to express the creeping, lassitudinous sense of terror he had felt when he heard the dead aspen leaves begin to crackle furtively down there in the cold darkness. But he told them about the soft sound of snow falling in clumps, about the lion with its head and its bunched shoulders working its way up and out of the snow to chase him. He even told them about how the rabbit had turned its head to watch near the end. The three of them were in the lobby. Jack had built a roaring blaze in the fireplace. Danny was bundled up in a blanket on the small sofa where once, a million years ago, 3 nuns had sat laughing like girls while they waited for the lion at the desk to thin out. He was sipping hot noodle soup from a mug. Wendy sat beside him, stroking his hair. Jack had sat on the floor, his face seeming to grow more and more still, more and more set as Danny told his story. Twice he pulled his handkerchief out of his back pocket and rubbed his sore-looking lips with it. "Then they chased me," he finished. Jack got up and went over to the window, his back to them. He looked at his mommy. "They chased me all the way up to the porch." He was struggling to keep his voice calm, because if he stayed calm, maybe they would believe him. Mr. Stinger hadn't stayed calm. He had started to cry and hadn't been able to stop, so the men in the white coats had come to take him away, because if you couldn't stop crying, it meant you had lost your marbles. And when would you be back? No one knows. His parka and snow pants and the clotted snowshoes lay on the rug just inside the big double doors.
I won't cry. I won't let myself cry.
And he thought he could do that, but he couldn't stop shaking. He looked into the fire and waited for Daddy to say something. High yellow flames danced on the dark stone hearth. A pine knot exploded with a bang, and the sparks rushed up the flue. Danny, come over here. Jack turned around. His face still had that pinched, deathly look. Danny didn't like to look at it.
Jack.
I just want the boy over here for a minute. Danny slipped off the sofa and came over beside his daddy. Good boy. Now what do you see? Danny had known what he would see even before he got to the window. Below the clutter of boot tracks, sled tracks, and snowshoe tracks that marked their usual exercise area, the snowfield that covered the overlook's lawn sloped down to the topiary and the playground beyond. It was marred by two sets of tracks, one of them in a straight line from the porch to the playground, the other a long, looping line coming back up.
Only my tracks, Daddy, but...
What about the hedges, Danny? Danny's lips began to tremble. He was going to cry. What if he couldn't stop?
I won't cry. I won't cry. I won't.
All covered with snow, he whispered. But Daddy... What? I couldn't hear you.
Jack, you're cross-examining him. Can't you see he's upset?
Shut up! Well, Danny?
They scratched me, Daddy. My leg.
You must have cut your leg on the crust of the snow. Then Wendy was between them, her face pale and angry.
What are you going to try and make him do? She asked him. Confess to murder? What's wrong with you?
The strangeness in his eyes seemed to break then. I'm trying to help him find the difference between something real and something that was only a hallucination, that's all. He squatted by Danny so that they were on an eye-to-eye level, and then hugged him tight. Danny, it didn't really happen, okay? It was like one of those trances you have sometimes, that's all.
Daddy!
What, Dan?
I ain't cut my leg on the crust. There isn't any crust. It's all powdery snow. It won't even stick together and make snowballs. Remember we tried to have a snowball fight and couldn't?
He felt his father stiffen against him. On the porch step, then. Danny pulled away. Suddenly he had it. It had flashed into his mind all at once, the way things sometimes did, the way it had about the woman wanting to be in that gray man's pants. He stared at his father with widening eyes.
You know I'm telling the truth, he whispered in shock.
Danny, Jack's face tightening.
You know because you saw...
The sound of Jack's open palm striking Danny's face was flat, not dramatic at all. The boy's head rocked back, the palm print reddening on his cheek like a brand. Wendy made a moaning noise. For a moment they were still, the three of them. And then Jack grabbed for his son and said, Danny, I'm sorry. You okay, Doc?
You hit him, you bastard!
Wendy cried. You dirty bastard! She grabbed his other arm, and for a moment Danny was pulled between them.
Oh, stop pulling me!
He screamed at them, and there was such agony in his voice, they both let him go. And then the tears had to come, and he collapsed, weeping. Between the sofa and the window, his parents staring at him helplessly, the way children might stare at a toy broken in a furious tussle, over to whom it belonged. In the fireplace, another pine knot exploded like a hand grenade, making them all jump. Wendy gave him baby aspirin, and Jack slipped him, unprotesting, between the sheets of his cot. He was asleep in no time, with his thumb in his mouth.
I don't like that, she said. It's a regression.
Jack didn't reply. She looked at him softly, without anger, without a smile either.
You want me to apologize for calling you a bastard? All right, I apologize. I'm sorry. You still shouldn't have hit him.
I know. I know that. I don't know what the hell came over me.
You promised you'd never hit him again.
He looked at her furiously, and then the fury collapsed. Suddenly, with pity and horror, she saw what Jack would look like as an old man. She had never seen him look that way before. What way? Defeated, she answered herself. He looks beaten. He said, I always thought I could keep my promises. She went to him and put her hands on his arm.
All right, it's over.
And when the ranger comes to check on us,
we'll tell him we all want to go down, all right?
All right, Jack said. And at that moment, at least, he meant it. The same way he had always meant it on those mornings after, looking at his pale and haggard face in the bathroom mirror. I'm gonna stop. I'm gonna cut it off flat. But morning gave way to afternoon. And in the afternoons, he felt a little better. And afternoon gave way to night. As some great 20th century thinker had said, night must fall. He found himself wishing that Wendy would ask him about the hedges, would ask him what Danny meant when he said, you know because you saw. If she did, he would tell her everything, everything. The hedges, the woman in the room, even about the fire hose that seemed to have switched positions. But where did confession stop? Could he tell her he'd thrown the magneto away? That they could all be down in the Sidewinder right now if he hadn't done that? What she said was,
do you want tea?
Yeah. A cup of tea would be good. She went to the door and paused there, rubbing her forearms through her sweater.
It's my fault as much as yours, she said. What we were doing while he was going through that dream or whatever it was.
Wendy?
We were sleeping. Sleeping like a couple of teenage kids with their itch nicely scratched.
Stop it. It's over.
No,
Wendy answered, gave him a strange, restless smile.
It's not over.
She went out to make tea, leaving him to keep watch over their son. Chapter 36. The elevator. Jack awoke from a thin and uneasy sleep, where huge and ill-defined shapes chased him through endless snowfields to what he first thought was another dream. Darkness, and in it, a sudden mechanical jumble of noises. Clicks and clinks, hummings, rattlings, snaps and whooshes. Then Wendy sat up beside him, and he knew it was no dream.
What's that?
Her hand, cold marble, gripped his wrist. He restrained an urge to shake it off. How in the hell was he supposed to know what it was? The illuminated clock on his nightstand said it was 5 minutes to 12. The humming sound again. Loud and steady, varying the slightest bit. Followed by a clank as the humming ceased. A rattling bang, a thump, then the humming resumed. It was the elevator. Danny was sitting up.
Daddy? Daddy?
His voice was sleepy and scared.
Right here, Doc,
Jack said.
come on over and jump in. Your mom's awake too.
The bedclothes rustled as Danny got on the bed between them.
It's the elevator,
he whispered. That's right, Jack said. Just the elevator.
What do you mean, just?
Wendy demanded. There was an ice skim of hysteria on her voice.
It's the middle of the night. Who's running it?
Hum. Click, clink. Above them now. The rattle of the gate accordioning back. The bump of the doors opening and closing. Then the hum of the motor and the cables again. Danny began to whimper. Jack swung his feet out of bed and onto the floor. It's probably a short. I'll check.
Don't you dare go out of this room!
Don't be stupid, he said, pulling on his robe. It's my job. She was out of bed herself a moment later, pulling Danny with her.
Well, we'll go too.
Wendy.
What's wrong?
Danny asked somberly.
What's wrong, Daddy?
Instead of answering, he turned away, his face angry and set. He belted his robe around him at the door, opened it, and stepped out into the dark hall. Wendy hesitated for a moment, and it was actually Danny who began to move first. She caught up quickly, and they went out together. Jack hadn't bothered with the lights. She fumbled for the switch that lit the 4 spaced overheads in the hallway that led to the main corridor. Up ahead, Jack was already turning the corner. This time, Danny found the switch plate and flicked all 3 switches up. The hallway leading down to the stairs and the elevator shaft came alight. Jack was standing at the elevator station, which was flanked by benches and cigarette urns. He was standing motionless in front of the closed elevator door. In his faded tartan bathrobe and brown leather slippers with the rundown heels, his hair all in asleep corkscrews and alfalfa cowlicks, he looked to her like an absurd 20th century Hamlet, an indecisive figure so mesmerized by onrushing tragedy that he was helpless to divert its course or alter it in any way. Jesus, stop thinking so crazy. Danny's hand had tightened painfully on her own. He was looking up at her intently, his face strained and anxious. He had been catching the drift of her thoughts, she realized. Just how much or how little of them he was getting was impossible to say, but she flushed, feeling much the same as if he had caught her in a masturbatory act.
Come on,
she said, and they went down the hall to Jack. The hummings and clankings and thumpings were louder here, terrifying in a disconnected, benumbed way. Jack was staring at the closed door with feverish intensity. Through the diamond-shaped window in the center of the elevator door, she thought she could make out the cables thrumming slightly. The elevator clinked to a stop below them at lobby level. They heard the doors thump open and...
Party!
Why had she thought party? The word had simply jumped into her head for no reason at all. The silence in the overlook was complete and intense, except for the weird noises coming up the elevator shaft. Must have been quite a party.
What party?
For just a moment her mind had filled with an image so real that it seemed to be a memory. Not just any memory, but one of those that you treasure, or one of those you keep for very special occasions and rarely mention aloud. Lights. Hundreds, maybe thousands of them. Lights and colors. The pop of champagne corks. A 40-piece orchestra playing Glenn Miller's In the Mood. But Glenn Miller had gone down in his bomber before she was born. How could she have a memory of Glenn Miller? She looked down at Danny and saw his head had cocked to one side, as if he was hearing something she couldn't hear. His face was very pale. Thump. The door had slid shut down there. A humming whine as the elevator began to rise. She saw the engine housing on top of the car. First through the diamond-shaped window, and then the interior of the car seen through the farther diamond shapes made by the brass gate. Warm yellow light from the car's overhead. It was empty. The car was empty. It was empty, but on the night of the party, they must have crowded in by the dozens. Crowded the car way beyond its safety limit, but of course, it had been new then, and all of them wearing masks.
What masks?
The car stopped above them on the third floor. She looked at Danny. His face was all eyes. His mouth was pressed into a frightened, bloodless slit. Above them, the brass gate rattled back. The elevator door thumped open. It thumped open because it was time. The time had come. It was time to say, "Good night, good night." Yes, it was lovely. No, I really can't stay for the unmasking. Early to bed, early to rise. Oh, was that Sheila? The monk? Isn't that witty, Sheila coming as a monk? Yes, good night. Good. Thump. Gears clashed. The motor engaged. The car began to wind back down.
Jack,
She whispered.
what is it? What's wrong with it?
Short circuit, he said. His face was like wood. I told you it was a short circuit.
I keep hearing voices in my head, she cried. What is it? What's wrong? I feel like I'm going crazy.
What voices? He looked at her with deadly blandness. She turned to Danny.
Did you?
Danny nodded slowly.
Yes, and music. Like from a long time ago in my head.
The elevator car stopped again. The hotel was silent, creaking, deserted. Outside, the wind whined around the eaves in the darkness. Maybe you're both crazy, Jack said conversationally. I don't hear a goddamn thing except that elevator having a case of the electrical hiccups. If you two want to have the duet hysterics, fine. Count me out. The elevator was coming down again. Jack stepped to the right, where a glass-fronted box was mounted on the wall at chest height. He smashed his bare fist against it. Glass tinkled inward. Blood dripped from two of his knuckles. He reached in and took out a key with a long, smooth barrel.
Jack, no, don't.
I'm gonna do my job. Now leave me alone, Wendy. She tried to grab his arm. He pushed her backward. Her feet tangled in the hem of her robe, and she fell to the carpet with an ungainly thump. Danny cried out shrilly and fell on his knees beside her. Jack turned back the elevator and thrust the key into the socket. The elevator cables disappeared, and the bottom of the car came into view into the small window. A second later, Jack turned the key hard. There was a grating, screeching sound as the elevator car came to an instant standstill. For a moment, the declutched motor in the basement whined even louder, and then its circuit breaker cut in and the overlook went unearthly still. The night wind outside seemed very loud by comparison. Jack looked stupidly at the gray metal elevator door. There was 3 splotches of blood below the keyhole from his lacerated knuckles. He turned back to Wendy and Danny for a moment. She was sitting up, and Danny had his arm around her. They were both staring at him carefully, as if he was a stranger they had never seen before, possibly a dangerous one. He opened his mouth, not sure what was going to come out. Wendy, it's my job, she said clearly.
Fuck your job.
He turned back to the elevator, worked his fingers into the crack that ran down the right side of the door, and got it to open a little way. Then he was able to get his whole weight on it and threw the door open. The car had stopped halfway, its floor at Jack's chest level. Warm light still spilled out on it, contrasting with the oily darkness of the shaft below. He looked in for what seemed like a long time. "It's empty," he said then. "Short circuit, like I said." He hooked his fingers into the slot behind the door, began to pull it closed. Then her hand was on his shoulder, surprisingly strong, yanking him away. "Wendy!" he shouted. But she had already caught the car's bottom edge and pulled herself up enough so she could look in. Then, with a convulsive heave on her shoulder and belly muscles, she tried to boost herself all the way up. For a moment, the issue was in doubt. Her feet tottered over the blackness of the shaft, and one pink slipper fell from her foot and slipped out of sight.
"Mommy!"
Danny screamed. Then she was up, her cheeks flushed, her forehead as pale and shining as a spirit lamp.
"What about this, Jack? Is this a short circuit?"
She threw something, and suddenly the hall was full of drifting confetti, red and white and blue and yellow.
"Is this?"
A green party streamer, faded to a pale pastel color with age.
"And this?"
She tossed it out, and it came to a rest on the blue-black jungle carpet. A black silk cat's eye mask, dusted with sequins at the temples.
"Does that look like a short circuit to you, Jack?"
She screamed at him. Jack stepped slowly away from it, shaking his head mechanically back and forth. The cat's eye mask stared up blankly at the ceiling from the confetti-strewn hallway carpet. Chapter 37. The Ballroom. It was the 1st of December. Danny was in the East Wing Ballroom, standing in an overstuffed, high-backed wing chair, looking at the clock under glass. It stood in the center of the ballroom's high ornamental mantelpiece, flanked by 2 large ivory elephants. He almost expected the elephants would begin to move and try to gore him with their tusks as he stood there, but they were moveless. They were safe. Since the night of the elevator, he had come to divide all things at the Overlook into 2 categories: the elevator, the basement, the playground, room 217, and presidential suite. It was suite, S-U-I-T-E, not suite, S-W-E-E-T. He had seen the correct spelling in an account book Daddy had been reading at supper last night, and had memorized it carefully. Those places were unsafe. Their quarters, the lobby, and the porch were safe. Apparently the ballroom was too. The elephants are, anyway. He was not sure about other places, and so avoided them on general principle. He looked at the clock inside the glass dome. It was under glass because all its wheels and cogs and springs were showing. A chrome or steel track ran around the outside of these works, and directly below the clock face there was a small axis bar with a pair of meshing cogs at either end. The hands of the clock stood at 11:15, and although he didn't know Roman numerals, he could guess by the configuration of the hands at what time the clock had stopped. The clock stood on a velvet base. In front of it, slightly distorted by the curve of the dome, it was a carefully carved silver key. He supposed that the clock was one of the things he wasn't supposed to touch. Like the decorative fire tools in their brass-bound cabinet by the lobby fireplace, or the tall china highboy at the back of the dining room. A sense of injustice and a feeling of angry rebellion suddenly rose in him, and never mind what I'm supposed to touch, just never mind, touched me, hasn't it? Played with me, hasn't it? It had. And it hadn't been particularly careful not to break him either. Danny put his hands out, grasped the glass dome, and lifted it aside. He let one finger play over the works for a moment, the pad of his index finger denting against the cogs, running smoothly over the wheels. He picked up the silver key. For an adult, it would have been uncomfortably small, but it fitted his own fingers perfectly. He placed it in the keyhole at the center of the clock face. It went firmly home with a tiny click, more felt than heard. It wound to the right, of course, clockwise. Danny turned the key until it would turn no more, and then removed it. The clock began to tick. Cogs turned. A large balance wheel rocked back and forth in semicircles. The hands were moving. If you kept your head perfectly motionless and your eyes wide open, you could see the minute hand inching along towards his meeting some 45 minutes from now with the hour hand at XII. And the Red Death held sway over all. He frowned and then shook the thought away. It was a thought with no meaning or reference for him. He reached his index finger out again and pushed the minute hand up to the hour, curious about what might happen. It obviously wasn't a cuckoo clock, but that steel rail had to have some purpose. There was a small ratcheting series of clicks, and then the clock began to tinkle Strauss's Blue Danube Waltz. A punched roll of cloth, no more than 2 inches in width, began to unwind. A small series of brass strikers rose and fell. From behind the clock face, 2 figures glided into view along the steel track. Ballet dancers on the left, a girl in a fluffy skirt and white stockings; on the right, a boy in a black leotard and ballet slippers. Their hands were held in arches over their heads. They came together in the middle, in front of VI. Danny espied tiny grooves in their sides, just below their armpits. The axis bar slipped through into these grooves, and he heard another small click. The cogs at either end of the bar began to turn. The Blue Danube tinkled. The dancers' arms came down around each other. The boy flipped the girl up over his head, and then whirled over the bar. They were now lying prone. The boy's head buried beneath the girl's short ballet skirt. The girl's face pressed against the center of the boy's leotard. They writhed in a mechanical frenzy. Danny's nose wrinkled. They were kissing pee-pees. That made him feel sick. A moment later, and things began to run backward. The boy whirled back over the axis bar. He flipped the girl into an upright position. They seemed to nod knowingly at each other as their hands arched back over their heads. They retreated the way they had come, disappearing just as the Blue Danube finished. The clock began to strike a count of silver chimes.
Midnight! Stroke of midnight!
Hooray for masks! Danny whirled on the chair, almost falling down. The ballroom was empty. Beyond the double cathedral window, he could see fresh snow beginning to sift down. The huge ballroom rug, rolled up for dancing, of course, a rich tangle of red and gold embroidery, lay undisturbed on the floor. Spaced around it were small, intimate tables for 2, the spidery chairs that went with each upended with legs pointing at the ceiling. The whole place was empty. But it wasn't really empty. 'Cause here in the Overlook, things just went on and on. Here in the Overlook, all times were one. There was an endless night in August of 1945, with laughter and drinks and a chosen shining few going up and coming down in the elevator, drinking champagne and popping party favors in each other's faces. It was a not yet light morning in June, some 20 years later, and the organization hitters endlessly pumped shotgun shells into the torn and bleeding bodies of 3 men who went through their agony endlessly. In a room on the second floor, a woman lolled in her tub and waited for visitors. In the Overlook, all things had a sort of life. It was as if the whole place had been wound up with a silver key. The clock was running. The clock was running. He was that key, Danny thought, sadly. Tony had warned him, and he had just let things go on. "I'm just 5, he cried to some half-felt presence in the room. "Doesn't make any difference that I'm just 5. There was no answer. He turned reluctantly back to the clock. He had been putting it off, hoping that something would happen to help him avoid trying to call Tony again. That a ranger would come, or a helicopter, or the rescue team. They always came in time on his TV programs. People were saved. On TV, the Rangers and the SWAT squad and the paramedics were a friendly white force counterbalancing the confused evil that he perceived in the world. When people got in trouble, they were helped out of it. They were fixed up. They did not have to help themselves out of trouble. Please? There was no answer. No answer, and if Tony came, would it be the same nightmare? The booming, the hoarse and petulant voice, the blue-black rug like snakes, red rum. But what else? Please, oh please. No answer. With a trembling sigh, he looked at the clock face. Cogs turned and meshed with other cogs. The balance wheel rocked hypnotically back and forth. And if you held your head perfectly still, you could see the minute hand creeping inexorably down from XII to V. If you held your head perfectly still, you could see that the clock face was gone. In its place was a round black hole. It led down into forever. It began to swell. The clock was gone. The room behind it. Danny tottered and then fell into the darkness that had been hiding behind the clock face all along. The small boy in the chair suddenly collapsed and lay in it at a crooked, unnatural angle, his head thrown back, his eyes staring sightlessly at the high ballroom ceiling. Down and down and down and down. The hallway. Crouched in the hallway, and he had made a wrong turn trying to get back to the stairs. He had made a wrong turn, and now, he saw he was in the short dead-end corridor that led only to the presidential suite. The booming sound was coming closer, the roque mallet whistling savagely through the air, the head of it embedding itself into the wall, cutting the silk paper, letting out small puffs of plaster dust. "God damn it, come out here, take your..." But there was another figure in the hallway, slouched nonchalantly against the wall just behind him, like a ghost. No, not a ghost, but all dressed in white. Dressed in whites. "I'll find you, you goddamn little whore-mastering runt!" Danny cringing back from the sound, coming up the main third-floor hall now. Soon the owner of that voice would round the corner. Come here, you little shit!" The figure dressed in white straightened up a little, removed a cigarette from the corner of his mouth, plucked a shred of tobacco from his full lower lip. It was Halloran, Danny saw, dressed in his cook's whites instead of the blue suit he had been wearing on closing day. "If there is trouble," Halloran said, "you give a call. A big loud holler, like the one that knocked me back a few minutes ago. I might hear you even way down in Florida. And if I do, I'll come on the run. I'll come on the run. I'll come on.
Come now, then. Come now. Come now. Oh, Dick, I need you. We all need.
Run. Sorry, but I gotta run. Sorry, Danny, old kid, old Doc, but I gotta run. It's sure been fun, you son of a gun, but I gotta hurry. I gotta run.
No.
But as he watched, Dick Halloran turned, put his cigarette back into the corner of his mouth, and stepped nonchalantly through the wall, leaving him alone. And that was when the shadow figure turned the corner, huge in the hallway's gloom, only the reflected red of its eyes clear.
There you are. Now I've got you, you fuck. Now I'll teach you.
It lurched towards him in a horrible, shambling run, the roque mallet swinging up and up and up, Danny scrambling backwards, screaming. Suddenly he was through the wall and falling, tumbling over and over, down the hall, down the rabbit hole, and into a land full of sick wonders. Danny was far below him. Tony was far below him, also falling. I can't come anymore, Danny. He won't let me near you. None of them will let me near you. Get Dick. Get Dick.
Tony,
he screamed. But Tony was gone, and suddenly he was in a dark room. But not entirely dark. Muted light, spilling from somewhere. It was Mommy and Daddy's bedroom. He could see Daddy's desk. But the room was a dreadful shambles. He had been in this room before. Mommy's record player overturned on the floor. Her records scattered on the rug, the mattress half off the bed. Pictures ripped off the walls. His cot lying in its side like a dead dog. The violent violet Volkswagen crushed to purple shards of plastic. The light was coming from the bathroom door, half open. Just beyond it, a hand dangled limply, blood dripping from the tips of the fingers. And in the medicine cabinet mirror, the word red rum, flashing off and on. Suddenly, a large clock in a glass bowl materialized in front of it. There were no hands or numbers on the clock face, only a date written in red. December 2. And then, eyes widening in horror, he saw the word red rum reflected dimly from the glass dome, now reflected twice, and he saw that it spelled murder. Danny Torrance screamed in wretched terror. The date was gone from the clock face. The clock face itself was gone, replaced by a circular black hole that swelled and swelled like dilating iris. It blotted out everything, and he fell forward, beginning to fall. Falling, he was falling off the chair. For a moment he lay on the ballroom floor, breathing hard. Red rum, murder. Red rum, murder. The Red Death shall held sway over all.
Unmask! Unmask!
And behind each glittering lovely mask, the as yet unseen face of the shape that chased him down these dark hallways, its red eyes widening, blank and homicidal. Oh, he was afraid of what that face might come to light when the time for unmasking came around at last. Dick! He screamed with all his might. His head seemed to shiver with the force of it.
Oh, Dick! Oh, please, please, please come!
Above him, the clock he had wound with the silver key continued to mark off the seconds and minutes and hours.